This week, to be closer to China, in March, President Xi Jinping conducted his first 2019 state visit to 3 European countries, Italy, Morocco, and France, advancing China-Europe relations. What issues were addressed? What challenges remain? More broadly, what features of President Xi's thought on diplomacy can be discerned?
Seeking a deeper, integrated and interdependent relationship with Europe.
A long-term relationship has to be built on mutual respect, it has to be built on mutual trust, and that really develops at the people-to-people level.
Everyone was really hopeful that China could be a real strong partner on multilateralism.
China says it pursues cooperation with other countries for mutual benefit, to contribute to the world, and to create a shared future for humankind. It requires concerted effort how to make it happen. This week, examine China's diplomacy to be closer to China. What is President Xi Jinping's grand vision for China in the world? The world is watching. Many are hopeful, some are fearful. Not a few wonder about Xi's intent. What will a rising China mean for international affairs? But there is now less need to wonder. President Xi makes his intent clear every time he speaks about diplomacy and China's growing global role. What are the features of Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy for a new era? How are they being implemented? All features sound uplifting, benefiting everyone through win-win cooperation. Why then the increasing resistance to China, not only from the U.S., but also from European and other countries? In March, President Xi conducted his first 2019 state visit in 3 European countries, Italy, Monaco, and France, evidencing Europe's central position in China's strategic thinking. We analyze China-Europe relations in particular, and then assess Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy in general, keeping us closer to China. 2019 marks the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China and the 41st anniversary of reform and opening up. 40 years have passed since the country began to open up to the world. China now faces a fresh set of foreign policy challenges. The country set its peaceful rise or peaceful development policy in the 1990s, which emphasized regional economic integration and multilateral confidence building. Is that still the case? In March 2019, President Xi made his first state visit of the year to 3 European countries, Italy, Monaco, and France, coming amidst EU concerns about China as a strategic rival and economic competitor, and about Brussels' struggle to craft a unified policy toward China among EU members. To discuss China-Europe relations and President Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy, we have in Brussels Ms. Shada Islam, Director, Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe, and Dr. Fabian Zulag, Chief Executive of the European Policy Center. And here in Washington, Mr. Surabh Gupta, Resident Senior Fellow, Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome, everyone. Well, President Xi Jinping has made his first state visit, and it was to Europe. And so what we will do is discuss China-Europe relations, but also use it as a lens to understand Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy for a new era, which guides China's foreign policy. Let's start with Italy, which of course was the big news because they signed the Belt and Road Initiative Memorandum of Understanding, which was controversial in some quarters. What were the highlights?
Well, very important because Italy becomes the first G7 country to sign up for this Memorandum of Understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative. And, you know, there were 29 deals done, $2.8 billion worth of projects signed. Modernization of the ports of Trieste, Palermo, Genoa. This is very important for Italy, which, as you know, at the moment is facing economic stagnation and perhaps even a recession. So Italy really needs funding, needs the financial resources, and has signed up for these deals. And I think for Italy it really is important that it is able, at this important economic juncture, to be able to attract foreign investment. And the hope here is that this is a bit of a wake-up call for the rest of Europe, and the fact that the Chinese are coming in perhaps will bring more European and perhaps even American funding into Italy, as I said, at this important economic time for it.
China never claims that it is doing these investments for eleemosynary charitable purposes. I mean, it may have some very positive impact, but mutual benefit means both sides benefit. So what are the impressions for the Chinese side? What is the Chinese side benefiting from its relationship with Italy? Surab?
I think the primary benefit for the Chinese side is seeking a deeper, integrated and interdependent relationship with Europe. The EU and China are huge economic actors in the international economic sphere. And as we've seen over the last couple of years, there have been these negative winds of protectionism, unilateralism, and populism, which perhaps threaten down the line to break this sort of interdependence into a bloc-like structure which do not trade as much with each other. And therefore, China, as a developing country on the cusp of becoming an advanced, developed country, sees a great horizon of growth ahead, a great opportunity of growth ahead, and that growth will only be powered by economic interdependence with the other great economic areas of the world. So I see China looking at this more from an interdependency relationship. Of course, down the line, if the US-China relationship were to sour, it's useful to have a deep integrated relationship with with Europe. But I don't think China's looking at it from that perspective. It just wants openness and interdependence to flourish.
In 2014, when addressing the APEC Economic Leaders meeting, President Xi stated that all the economies in the region need to work together to build an Asia-Pacific partnership of mutual trust, inclusiveness, cooperation, and win-win progress. On China-EU relations in 2015, President Xi called for promoting the China-EU partnership for peace, growth, reform, and civilization to achieve a comprehensive strategic partnership for mutual benefit. The pursuit of mutual benefit and win-win results has infused all of China's diplomatic proclamations, including Sino-African relations, Sino-Arab relations, China's comprehensive strategic partnership with Russia, China's call for cooperation as the only sound path for China-US relations, and China's engagement with BRICS. Let's move on to France. What was the dynamic between Macron and Xi Jinping?
First of all, yes, Macron was, I think, very elegant in the way he received President Xi Jinping. I mean, earlier in Brussels, he had talked about how Europe shouldn't be naive when dealing with China. Well, when he was actually with the President Xi Jinping, his attitude was very courteous, very polite. I mean, he got the full red carpet treatment, so I think that was a good sign. But I mean, why wouldn't he do that? Secondly, I think a very important message there, actually, Robert, because Angela Merkel from Germany and Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, were also there. That's very unusual. These state visits don't really have that component, and I think when President Trump is retreating from certain global responsibilities, whether it comes to trade or climate change or how to deal with Iran, Europe is really looking to China for support for global challenges. And that message was really given by Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, saying we need to keep markets open, we need China for multilateral liberalization and to reinforce the WTO, World Trade Organization. So two very important messages coming out from the visit to Paris.
In 2014, when Xi visited the Netherlands, in a signed article published in the Dutch media, he called Europe an important pole in a multipolar world and China's comprehensive strategic partner. In 2018, at the 10th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, Xi urged upholding multilateralism, supporting multilateral trade, and fully observing collectively adopted international rules. In March 2019 in Paris, when President Xi met with French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and European Commission Chief Jean-Claude Juncker, they stressed upholding multilateralism to address issues ranging from peace and security to climate change and trade. China's determination to protect multilateralism has diverse expressions, from combating global climate change, promoting South-South cooperation, and contributing to global poverty alleviation, to supporting reforms of the WTO and UN, establishing China-UN Peace and Development Funds, and putting forward multilateral cooperation mechanisms like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative. China's contribution to multilateralism is recognized within the international community. For example, at the 2018 Boao Forum for Asia, the Singapore Prime Minister said, "It is in China's fundamental interest to contribute more to strengthening multilateralism in keeping with its larger weight in the world." Okay, let's go to the second country that President Xi visited, Monaco, obviously a very small country, but the phrase used was that this is a fine example of friendly exchanges. What was so fine about these exchanges with Monaco, sort of?
You have China out here, which is this huge, huge country, and talks about win-win cooperation and multilateralism, and there are many countries in the West who view that with skepticism, and they feel that, you know, China is so big and it would like to do things only on a bilateral basis and bring its weight to bear and gain advantages. And then you have Monaco, which is a small country, small principality out there, but the fact that they can interact as equals itself sends a very strong signal, which China has sent hitherto in its relations with other European countries also, most notably the 16+1 format, that if you are small or big, it does not really matter. And if you are small and you all can bunch together in a grouping, we will interact with you as a group. That China is not about to engage in predatory behavior just because of the size differential. I think the fact that President Xi Jinping went to Monaco, a place where I don't think I've seen many a leader from the United States or from other big countries go to, itself, I think, sends a good signal that China is willing to be more forthcoming in this regard. China
actually has a long history of treating all countries exactly with the same protocol. Other countries do, but China does it in a special way. I've noticed that from my many years in China. It sometimes seems odd that the very big countries and the very small countries will be treated the same way. Because of the impact and the importance, but there's a certain a global elegance to that, which I've learned to appreciate. Isn't it the case that, as Fabian just said, that the world, with very nice term multilateralism, everybody feels included, but are we not moving towards really a bilateral world? And if that is not desirable, what can Europe do to make sure that bilateral is not the future, but multilateral is?
You know, multilateralism, countries coming together to cooperate, collective leadership. This is the essence of what Europe is about. It doesn't always work out that way. Even within Europe, we have lots of areas of contestation, but that is what we stand for. And that is where I think, as I said earlier, China can play a very important role. Now, you may remember about, I think it was in Davos, when President Xi Jinping stood out and talked about maintaining the multilateral system, the rules-based order. he got a standing ovation. That was a time when everyone was really hopeful that China could be a real strong partner on multilateralism. Now it's time to walk the talk, and it's time to start showing that we can actually do things. And where is there the most fragility at the moment? It's the vulnerability that is on the multilateral trading system within the World Trade Organization. Now we know, all of us know, that the WTO was set up years ago. It sort of, coincided with and reflected European and American interests, and countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa feel slightly outside. They did not make the rules, they're taking the rules, but it's time now to reform and bring their voices into this conversation. But where do we start? We have to start with the reform, as I said earlier, of the appellate body, but then move into new areas. E-commerce is something that is very important, digital technology, cyberspace, and this is the area where we're really looking for China to take up the baton of multilateralism and show that it can work with Europe on this. Europe can't do it alone. It will have to work with countries which are like-minded, but also countries which are unlike-minded. So that's the challenge for us, and I'm really hopeful that this is an area where we can actually show and point to a real success of China-Europe cooperation.
While stating it upholds multilateralism, China calls for building a shared future for humankind.
A Chinese adage reads, "Victory is ensured when people pool their strength. Success is secured when people put their heads together." As long as we keep to the goal of building a community of shared future for mankind and work hand in hand to fulfill our responsibilities and overcome difficulties, we will be able to create a better world and deliver better lives for our people.
In line with his ideas on global governance, this March, when meeting with European leaders at a global governance forum co-hosted by China and France in Paris, President Xi proposed a four-pronged approach: fairness and reasonableness to address the governance deficit, consultation and understanding to address the trust deficit, joint efforts and mutual assistance to address the peace deficit, and mutual benefit and win-win results to address the development deficit. Well, let's face the alternative side of this very positive visit. On March 12th, the European Commission published a paper, the EU-China, a strategic outlook, in which it called China, and I think I'm quoting this accurately, an economic competitor in the pursuit of technological leadership and a systematic rival promoting alternative models of governance. Both very powerful, the former economic, the latter political. Why was this published? What was the reason for it now? And what's the impact of it? And isn't it proper that we should put it front and center in analyzing President Xi's visit to Europe?
There's nothing new in that, but that doesn't mean that competitors can't compete and cooperate at the same time. And I think this is what we should be aiming for. I think on the political side, yes, there is a wariness. Of course, there's also pressure from the US. But I think the key here is whether China over the next years will show that it can take a global leadership role in defending those kind of institutions which help all of the countries to feel comfortable in that global economic and political system. And in particular there, I think it is very important that China commits to the WTO and the reform which is necessary so that we can continue to have at least some form of framework at the global level.
President Xi talked about having consultation and understanding with China, and he did it in the context of describing four deficits: a deficit in governance, in trust, in peace and development. So four deficits. What do you think the motivation why President Xi did that, and what insight can that give us into his thought on diplomacy?
I think it's an important point, really important point to touch upon, because if you see in commentary, this concept of that we are coming to an age of traps, the Thucydides trap, US and China fated to compete and big power and the emerging power. We hear things like the Kindleberger trap. We are in a moment of transition and nobody is about to provide the public goods that are necessary to maintain the stability. And I think it's important in this regard, with regard to these deficits or traps, to be aware of them early so that we know where we are headed down the line, and we can find remedial ways in which people can all come together and do the needful. We saw this moment arise immediately after the global financial crisis, when countries banded together and there was the stimulus and everybody chipped in. But that sense has faded. And what President Xi is alluding to in partly out here is that we still are at an inflection, difficult, transitional moment, transitional age. And therefore, all parties need to contribute to the at the table. And I think that's why it's important, I wouldn't say to harp on these things, but as a cautionary note to keep it away, known to all the players, big, medium, and intermediate, and small, that they all need to shoulder their responsibilities if the global system is to prosper.
You've all heard the terms China threat, China challenging the world order, systemic rival. It would be naive to assume that these terms are just made up by some anti-China bashers in some American think tanks, but because of the broad bipartisan attitude in the U.S., one would have to think there's some antecedent to these terms.
For me, at least for Europeans, and I can't talk for the U.S. here, but for Europeans, I think if China could be a real defender of multilateralism, if it could show that it can take a global leadership role in a positive way, and also live with the consequences that has domestically. Leadership doesn't come for free. Leadership means responsibility as well. It means addressing some of the issues which are still there within China. I think if we saw that, Europeans would feel much more comfortable with a bigger global role for China.
In his speech at the United Nations in Geneva in 2017, President Xi called for building an open and inclusive world through exchanges and mutual learning. And he stressed that diverse civilizations should draw on each other to achieve common progress. With such emphasis on exchanges of civilizations, China has established people-to-people dialogue mechanisms with Russia, the U.S., France, the U.K., the EU, Indonesia, South Africa, and Germany. People-to-people programs involve education cooperation and exchanges with 188 nations and regions, and with 46 key international organizations. China says it seeks to nurture friendship and promote mutual understanding and trust. The China-EU high-level people-to-people dialogue, established in Brussels in 2012, has a broad mandate, covering education, technology, culture, media, women, and youth. Angela Vassilo, former European Commissioner for Education, Culture, Multilingualism, and Youth, said, "The people-to-people dialogue will open up our contacts and cooperation on a wide range of issues, bringing real benefits to European and Chinese citizens." During his European visit in March 2019, President Xi emphasized the importance of people-to-people exchanges. In a signed article published in a French newspaper, he said, "The progress of human history shows that exchanges and mutual learning between civilizations have made our world a more colorful place and provided a powerful underpinning for cooperation among countries and nations." In a signed article published in an Italian newspaper, he stressed that Sino-Italian friendship is carried forward through our intensive cultural exchanges. Chinese and Italians have a deep interest in each other's cultures. As much as economic development and mutual benefit and win-win cooperation exemplified by the Belt and Road Initiative is a prime element of Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy for the new era, another one that seems smaller, which is people-to-people exchanges, inclusiveness, mutual learning, is put on the same level. Normally we talk about the big economic things and then some of these other sort of nice things to do, but President Xi really puts them part of the same package on the same level. So I want to understand what that means, particularly in terms of China-Europe relations, people-to-people exchanges. Again, President Xi puts this on virtually the same level as economic development in terms of its importance. So from Europe's perspective, Fabian, what are examples of people-to-people exchanges, and is that recognized in Europe at the level of importance that President Xi would like it to be?
I think in many ways that's something which we should take seriously, because a long-term relationship has to be built on mutual respect, it has to be built on mutual trust, and that really develops at the people-to-people level. I think there are many ways in which that can be fostered. I think an exchange of people. We're already seeing students in relatively large numbers, but there's certainly more to do there. I think travel between China and the European Union is also increasing. But I would also say it takes time. People-to-people exchanges are not something which is created overnight. Trust is not something which is built overnight. So the more we can foster it, the more we can build fora to build that trust, I think the better our relationship will be in the long term.
I think we should go into the school system, bring people together, have exchanges not just of classical Chinese music and classical Chinese opera, but pop stars, rock stars, get to know each other, modern day China. You know, I always say to my Chinese friends, we learn a lot about old China, antique China, beautiful China. What we need to know more in our societies is about the young, dynamic, rock China, you know, the things that are happening. People here still, I'm sorry to say, sometimes think of China as lagging behind in technology. You know, this whole discussion about 5G is sort of symptomatic of that. We need to know how far advanced China is in many of the digital and IT skills that we still, you know, are working on. So give us a snapshot. Bring us modern day pop, rock, young China, and let's get a conversation going on that.
There are three ways to assess Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy for a new era. The first is to listen to what President Xi himself stresses: building a community with a shared future for all humanity, safeguarding world peace and promoting common development, inclusiveness and mutual learning through people-to-people exchanges, and multilateralism. The second is its formal exposition. Yang Jiechi, China's state counselor and director of the Office of the Central Leading Group for Foreign Affairs, described 10 principles, including CPC authority, major country diplomacy, shared growth through discussion and collaboration, mutual respect and beneficial cooperation, global partnerships, reforming global governance, safeguarding national sovereignty, and creating a unique brand of diplomacy by combining China's fine traditions and contemporary features. The third way to assess Xi Jinping's thought on diplomacy is to discern its underlying motivations or drivers. I suggest 8. Complementary development, supporting the domestic economy, protecting core interests, mitigating global crises, managing international incidents, assuming global responsibilities, setting a global example, and rejuvenating national pride. Notwithstanding tensions catalyzed by a rising China, in today's world, the real conflict is not between opposing political systems, but rather between the forces of modernity, competence, and development on the one hand, and those of ignorance, exploitation, and oppression on the other. China's increasing engagement with global diplomacy should be celebrated. That's closer to China.